Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Thank you so much for joining our conversation with David Ignatius and David Sanger. Among the many topics that they will be discussing is, of course, David Ignatius' bestseller, spy thriller, The Paladin. But this, of course, will just be a launching point, because as you might imagine, when you have two masters who have each broken some of the most important foreign policy stories of our time, we'll just see where the conversation takes them. So a quick introduction of these two men, two graduates of Harvard. David Ignatius has been with the Washington Post since 1986. And during his career, he's held a number of key positions, from being the editor of the Sunday Outlook section. He was foreign editor. And then he had probably 3 delightful years as being the executive editor of the International Herald Tribune. The Paladin is his 11th spy novel. In fact, Body of Lies was made into a film in 2008, starring no other than Leonardo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe. His foreign affairs column is published twice weekly in the Washington Post. It's one of the major reasons that I subscribe to the paper. David Sanger is a national security correspondent and senior writer for the New York Times. And he has been part of three teams that have won the Pulitzer Prize. He's the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers. His latest book, which is also available at Interabang, is The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. And it certainly is a perfect complement to The Paladin. After spending some 6 years reporting from Tokyo, David turned his attention to national security and defense issues, particularly nuclear proliferation. And you may remember that he revealed the incredible story of Stuxnet when the US and Israel worked together to derail Iran's nuclear weapons program. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will turn it over now to David Sanger and David Ignatius.
Well, thanks very much. Great to be with you, and great to be back with the Dallas World Affairs Council. I had a great time being down there when The Perfect Weapon came out. And I'm really delighted to be here with my friend David as he brings out The Paladin. 11 novels, David, that's pretty remarkable. The first question is where you find the time, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. David's tired of hearing me say this, but it's always much more fun to learn about cyber through his novels than through the nonfiction that I write, because there are a lot steamier scenes in it, and he doesn't have to do any footnotes, which I always consider to be, 2 great things. And there's no fact checking you really have to go do. It's just the wonders of your imagination. But anybody who has read one of David's novels, particularly those that have veered off into cyber territory, and each one gets more cyberish along the way, the intelligence friends of mine will all tell you that these really strike very close to the truth, and in some ways reveal more truths in doing the fiction than you can get away with in doing nonfiction. So, David, congratulations, and let me start with this. Tell us about this strange, conflicted, poor CIA guy named Michael Dunn, who you have created to guide us through the bizarre world of cyber.
I have to just say at the outset, thank you to my friend David Sanger. We've done this on each other's books now for a little while. In our business, you're supposed to be competitors, and David and I do compete, but we're also friends and have been for many years, and I'm just really pleased that David was willing to do this. Jim Falk and the Dallas World Affairs Council, like David, I've visited you often in the past. It's one of my favorite councils in the country. I'm always struck by what I like to call the internationalism of the heartland out in Dallas, Texas. People see the world, understand it, want to learn about it, invite people like me and David Sanger to talk with them, and today to come into their homes. So it's great. And also thanks to the Jacobs for sponsoring this. So in this book, the hero is named Michael Dunn. He is a young CIA operations officer. He specializes in S&T, science and technology operations, which means he helps make and plant the bugs that listen to conversations. He works on cyber espionage. He interested me to answer David's question because I wanted to find a character to drive this story who would be from the part of America that really changed America in the 2016 election, from the angry Rust Belt, carrying all that emotions voters did, and the voters who elected Donald Trump. So he's from a busted steel town. He's from McKeesport, Pennsylvania. I know McKeesport and the Pittsburgh area because that was my first job covering the Steelworkers Union back in the 1970s. And I watched this long, slow collapse of America's basic manufacturing at the beginning. So that character interests me. I read a book called Hillbilly Elegy, many of you may have seen, by J.D. Vance at the beginning of working on the book, and I thought, somebody like that, if I could find a way to bring him into my story, it would enrich it. What happens in this book to Michael Dunn is that he's assigned to do something overseas, to penetrate a supposed news organization based in Italy run by an American that in fact is experimenting with the most dangerous kinds of disinformation and what are called deep fakes, as we'll discuss in our conversation. But David, I wanted to have somebody rooted in, a bombed out steel town who is sent out in the world, who basically is betrayed by his agency and a lot of the people he works with, and then finds his way back. And that's the arc of the story.
Yeah, well, it's a great read. It's great fun. And Pittsburgh's really a great background for it because some of your characters had gone to Pitt, which now has a very active cyber information school and does lots of events that we're interested in. You mentioned that the key to this was going after a news organization, but it's a very thinly veiled WikiLeaks, right? So it's called a news organization, but it doesn't act like any news organization you and I have ever worked for. They don't worry very much about who their sources are. They don't vet information. They get documents, they throw them out on the web, and they're considered to be by the CIA to be a foreign intelligence operation, which is exactly what Mike Pompeo, when he was the director of the CIA, called WikiLeaks. We moved from "I love WikiLeaks," which was what President Trump said during the campaign in 2016, to Pompeo saying, "I hate WikiLeaks. They are, in fact, no different than a foreign intelligence operation." So tell me a little bit about why that's a particular problem for the CIA.
WikiLeaks has had the ability, as we've seen again and again, to get information from different sources, from Chelsea Manning in the famous dump of U.S. State Department cables, to the fronts for the Russians in the documents from the Clinton campaign that were put out during the 2016 election. WikiLeaks is in that netherland between a news organization and not a news organization, and it's one of the interesting questions that we struggle with. I have to say, it's not like any news organization that you or I have ever worked for in terms of the way it operates. The New York Times and Washington Post carefully vet information before publication. What WikiLeaks says it does vetting too, but certainly not in the way that the Post and the Times do. There are other differences. I do want to stress that in this novel, my news organization, it's called Fallen Empire, and it is in the business of putting out information. It sees itself as a kind of band of social bandits. It goes way beyond WikiLeaks in the sense that I've never known WikiLeaks to put out documents that are false. Fallen Empire is creating in the computer false imagery, false documents, information that's not true to try to achieve its ends. That's why the CIA is interested in the first place. It has capabilities in this area that they think are very advanced, but it's also why it's different and a step beyond WikiLeaks or really anything that we've seen in this space.
You know, I promised myself as I was going through this, I was, underlining madly and saying, I've got to ask about this and that. And then I set myself a cutoff at page 100 arbitrarily so that I would not, ruin any good moments because there are so many great turns in the novel. But fairly early on, when Michael Dunn is trying to go struggle with all of this, there's this great line where a CIA officer, a senior one, says, "Someone is turning off our cyber weapons in Europe." And this reminded me of a group a little less known than WikiLeaks to many who are joining us today. But you timed this in September of 2016. That's when this begins to unfold. Of course, there was a little presidential election underway at the time. We were discovering, just excavating what the Russians were doing. And at the same moment, a group called the Shadow Brokers appeared suddenly on the web, on Twitter, offering up what turned out to be stolen NSA cyber weapons. And so while there was a good deal of WikiLeaks in this, I thought I detected a little bit of shadow brokers too. So talk to us a little bit about the true and the fictional shadow brokers and how they figure into this, because they're not quite a news organization.
Shadow Brokers is an organization that we still don't know all that much about. They've stayed in the shadows, at least in terms of what I've been able to read, and I think what you've been able to publish to an amazing extent. But they have put online some documentation that people who work for these agencies say just gutted some of the secrets that they worried most about, and it set loose a kind of mischief because these tools are very dangerous and damaging. What I was looking at, David, was background in sort of groups that do hacking for hire, that create cyber tools, malicious cyber tools. There's a lot of that in Europe. I had some particular groups in mind, but I think that our viewers may not realize that this has become a kind of industry where smart young hackers from Eastern Europe, Italy, all over the world, Asian countries are creating these tools and then selling them. And picking up when things are leaked from agencies like NSA, picking up bits of that tradecraft to put into their arsenal. And it's, in a sense, the privatization of these very powerful and dangerous tools. That's what I wanted to write about, the way in which all of us, as we enter information space, are subject to being taken down, attacked, through the places we work, through our personal accounts and information, by folks out there who may be connected with another government, but often I think are just kind of free floating in this weird new private sector. Shadow brokers is the scariest example. I have to be honest, nobody knows more about this in our business than David Sanger, so I should be putting that question to you. But yes, it was in the background of my thing.
Well, just to remind everybody, it was tools that were revealed by shadow brokers that the North Koreans used in the attack that somewhat accidentally brought down the British healthcare system. And that in NotPetya, which was a Russian-based attack, brought down Maersk and Federal Express and caused huge havoc. And, you ask people about Snowden or other examples within the intelligence world, and they'll talk to you about it, and you ask about shadow brokers, and they go totally silent. So it gives you a sense of how troublesome they were. So David, deep fakes are a big part of the book. And of course, people who were worried running in the run-up to the 2020 election that this would be the election of deep fakes, that you might see somebody impersonating President Trump on Twitter or on TV saying something outrageous, or maybe even Joe Biden saying something stupid, and it wouldn't really be them. It would be a fake made to look like them, or a congressman or a senator, or you'd see a picture of them walking out of the wrong hotel at the wrong time or something like that. So far, we haven't seen as much of that in the 2020 cycle as we had expected, though it's early yet. But tell us a little bit about what the real fear is and then how it plays in the book.
Let me just begin by explaining to viewers who may not follow this technology a little bit about what it is. We're familiar with fake news where people amplify information, distort it, pump it through our system. Deep fakes allows you to create fake events. Deep fakes allows you to create video and audio imagery that looks so real that even for professionals, it's very hard to detect. We actually, thanks to Jim and his colleague Rachel Vogel, can show the audience an example of an early deep fake. So you'll see what David Sanger and I are talking about in this video.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time.
So,
and that's a few years old, isn't it? I mean, it's gotten a lot better.
So it's gotten a lot better. So just so people understand, how on earth was that fake Barack Obama created? And as David says, the new ones would be much harder to detect. Essentially, you create a neural network, a string of computers, and you program it through machine learning so that it assimilates all the video imagery of David Ignatius or David Sanger, and then you instruct it to create fake David. And so you have an image like what we just saw, and then you run it against another neural network, which is what's called detect fake David. And so fake David runs, and detect fake David sees the little things around the mouth that weren't quite right in that Barack Obama video, and the shadow that wasn't quite natural, the way the lighting was just off. So detect fake, pings fake David. It gets better. Another version, another set of detections, and it gets better and better, climbs the ladder until it's at a point where it's, as I said earlier, very difficult to know what's real and what's false. And these things are coming at us, as David knows, in our politics. I think this is going to be a constant concern in the 2020 campaign and in future ones. It's going to come at us in business. I have a number of examples in my book where businesses are hobbled by the creation of false information. You can, in the computer, you can create imagery that makes somebody's watch it believe that there's been a tanker spill, a huge oil leak that would transform the stock price of the company, that would create an uproar. I have another example where you could create video that suggested the CEO of a huge company that was dependent on that person's leadership, that CEO had a fatal disease and will be gone in a month, and you could leak that video and drive trading. So these things are coming at us, and David, I think people in our business as journalists have a really interesting and difficult new challenge. How are we going to be sophisticated enough to help find our way through the information stream that comes at us, and know with confidence to tell our readers, this is a true piece of information, you can have confidence in it, and know this, we think this is false, designed to mislead us. It's a real challenge for us.
It's a huge challenge. And in fact, at the Times, we've actually started up a digital forensics unit that helps us sort of wind our way through this, and also helps us piece together stories that come from a mix of satellite and on-ground stuff. So they help in the story reporting, but also in the vetting when these moments come along. And we've promised Jim that for one of our next books, we're actually going to have a deep fake of each David, and see if we can make the conversation work for an hour without anybody sort of picking the thing up. Some people think it might be an improvement. Let's talk a little bit about the privatization of intelligence, which, as you say, comes along in this book, along with the way private companies are hurt. You know, just as this book is situated in September of 2016, that's just when you and I were on the phone with the CrowdStrikes of the world and others who were called in by the Democratic National Committee to figure out that it was the Russians. And guess what? We got a lot more information out of CrowdStrike than we did out of the NSA. And in fact, we used data that we got from the private companies to pry information out of the government by saying, hey, look, you don't have a monopoly anymore on this kind of data. We've got their full digital reports about what happened, who the players were. We're getting ready to run with it. If you want to comment on it, you've got an hour, which is a very different place for these agencies to be than in the days of the Cold War, when they really had a monopoly on the satellite photographs and the info and so forth. So tell us a little bit about how the privatization of all of this has affected it and how it affects the novel.
Well, there's a market for this talent, obviously. If you go to DEF CON, the convention for hackers out in Las Vegas, I don't know when the next DEF CON will take place.
It just got canceled. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm sorry to hear that and glad to hear that. But if you went to a DEF CON in the past, as I'm sure David has and I have, you'll see the competition for talent among smart young hackers. You walk into the auditorium at DEF CON and there is scrolling in front of you just a stream of all the usernames and passwords that are being hacked all around you.
Cell phone as you walk through.
Yeah, so like, you know, do not bring your cell phone to this convention. But you know, you'll see recruiters from NSA lurking in the background. You'll see recruiters from these private security firms. There is a hot market for this talent. You'll see a lot of faces for folks from overseas. You can, you know, attend this if your address is Shanghai, China, or Moscow, or whatever you like. And I have found, as David has, that these can be the most useful sources because they understand this world of cyber weapons, both offense and defense, extremely well. So once upon a time, the consultants were really on the defensive end. They would test your systems, they'd try to penetrate them, they'd show how vulnerable you were. It's called pen testing, and it was the way a lot of hackers made their money 10, 15 years ago. It's moved on from being purely defensive to a new area, which people call active defense. But what active defense really means is you hack back. If you're a bank, if you're a law firm, if you've been a target of attacks and you want to go to the heart, you want to stop this and go to the people who have held you for ransom, who are threatening your clients' identities. There are people in this marketplace you can hire to hack back. It's not legal, although this is a little bit of a gray area, but I'm told, I'm sure David has heard the same thing, that there's increasing use of these offensive tools by people who feel completely vulnerable. Again, that's the world I'm trying to describe in the Paladin. People feel naked and unprotected in a world where there's such sophisticated malicious cyber activity coming at them from governments, from private companies, from groups that have a social agenda, whatever it is, and people want protection, so they go to these consultants.
And what's really remarkable, and I think you portray it really well in the book, is these people are living right on the edge of the law, right? Hacking back, as you point out, is illegal in the United States, but it's not illegal in every country. So we have seen companies and individuals go hire someone who's in a country that doesn't have strong laws against this, or may have no laws against it, and do their hacking for them, because of this odd world in which we live, in which the cyber activity is without boundary, but the laws governing it all have to do with the boundary of where you are at the time you do it. So it's not that hard to go find a place that will tolerate it. It's basically the Switzerland or the Bahamas of certain financial activity, right? You have real life CIA officers these days who are afraid of getting done, to take the name of your character, which is to say, hung out to dry because they were doing something that they thought the agency had approved, but it had not. We saw this, of course, in the enhanced interrogation, some would call it torture, where, of course, later on you had officers who were being held accountable for activity that they thought had been approved by agency lawyers. Now that's much more likely to happen in the cyber realm, where they're taking steps that, again, are questionable. In this case, going after a group that some might consider to be a news organization, which is off limits. So where did this come from, David?
Well, the book opens with my hero, Michael Dunn, in court. His lawyers want him to make a plea agreement and say nice things to the judge, and he just can't do it. He feels he's been set up by his former agency colleagues and left holding the bag after this operation to go after what calls itself a news organization, which is a violation of CIA regulations. And he is accused of having lied about that to the FBI. And so there he is. I think it is true that there's a generation of intelligence officers who just feel that they were encouraged to do things. As you said, David, they were told they were legal. They went off and did them, and then they felt intense jeopardy. I think we can say, we should say, that if you were given an order to conduct what amounts to torture, even if somebody said it had legal approval, if it had been, had an Office of Legal Counsel opinion to support it, hopefully we'd like officers to say, I just can't do that. I'll have to resign. I'm just not prepared to do that. But there are lots of examples of people feeling that they were encouraged to do something, then the political winds changed on all sorts of things. It doesn't have to be as complicated, visceral as torture. Political winds changed. They and the people they worked with were just kind of left holding the bag, hung out to dry. I've seen a little bit of this, to be honest, traveling in northeast Syria, where you have thousands of people who felt they were being made promises by the United States, who feel abandoned. I've seen that in Iraq. It's something that we do. We encourage people to take risks, whether they're CIA officers or foreign nationals. And then when political winds shift, those folks are left alone. So it's pretty common these days for CI officers to take out their own legal insurance just to make sure that if something ever happened, they wouldn't be stuck with these basic life-shattering legal bills. So I think one of the things I do feel is, as a country, we're so good about respecting and honoring our military officers. We see soldiers in uniform in an airport or a ball game. People just stop. They just want to clap. They want to thank, reach out. Thank you for your service. We don't have that same response of feeling protective toward diplomats who risk their lives in difficult places, or intel officers. And that's wrong. We should look at them in the same way, I think, that we do our military.
All through the book, I say this without giving anything away. There's the background of what in my world they call perception hacks, which is to say, you don't really need to hack into something. You just need to make people think that you may have. This is a big issue for the coming election, because if Vladimir Putin decided he wanted to come back in, he doesn't have to hack every state in the union. He's just got to get a couple of key districts and a couple of battleground states in order for people to think, oh my God, if they've gotten into this district in this state, they must have gotten into every district in every state, even if they didn't. So we've gotten to feel far more vulnerable than perhaps we really are.
Well, I hope you're right that we're less vulnerable than we appear or think we are. I believe, and I think you've written this yourself, David, that the real Russian object in 2016 wasn't just to help Donald Trump, although that was the judgment of our intelligence agencies, but really to sow mistrust in American society about our politics in general, our sources of information. I think the Russians would never be happier than to hear people say, I don't trust anybody. It's all rigged. That's all, it's just a game. That's the moment that our adversaries really savor, when Americans are just basically giving up on our democratic process, losing trust in their elected officials. Man, they've dreamed of that. And I think, as you say, the Russians won't have to do much to generate that fear again. And just to take the conversation back to the question of deep fakes, these fake events, in a world where people are aware that you can create something that looks real in a computer, who's to stop somebody who's accused of something real, really did happen, from saying, that's made up, it's imaginary? I mean, suppose the Access Hollywood tape, famous conversations that President Trump had that almost cost him the election. Suppose people had been as aware then as they are now that this could have been computer generated. And suppose Trump had said, never happened, I didn't say it, this is a fake, this is a hoax, it's been done in a computer, folks don't believe it. And I'll bet that would have a lot of traction. So it's not just the ability to create a false information, it's the ability to use this world where information is so suspect to suppress real information. That's part of the problem that scares me and that you and I keep trying to write about in our lives as journalists.
And could well happen if at the end of the election, one candidate or the other says this vote was rigged, Well,
you see a ground being prepared for that, I fear. And, it's a huge challenge for people in David's and my business of journalism to, without being partisan, without keeping our independence, to be fact checkers, to distinguish between what are real threats and what are imagined threats that are trying to destabilize voters as they head toward the election.
Thank you both so much for spending the part of your afternoon with us. It's been a great conversation. If you'd like to see one of our prior webinars, please go to our YouTube channel, dfwworld, and subscribe. Lawrence Wright, Jonathan Carl, those are just two that we've just posted. And again, I want to thank the Jacobs for hosting today's webinar. Thanks so much. We'll see you tomorrow.